welcome to Exploring Opportunities with Tribal Nations and Indigenous Peoples panel. It's great to see you all here. Welcome back if you were at the panel last year. My name is Mariah Blackbird Perry and I will be your panel moderator, and I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves as we have some very impressive panelists here today.
Okay, well, umbiyagandi unsingiti na hap o oinge omu tanteki sido newe apoyits joapi khawe. So again, good afternoon in my Tewa language. My name is Michael Chabria. I serve as governor for Santa Clara Pueblo. This is my 13th one-year term serving as the governor. I fought 5 years wildland fire back in the day, worked as a conservation officer, a water quality coordinator, and served 25 years in tribal government for Santa Clara Pueblo. And so I'd like to welcome all of you for our panel this afternoon. Thank you. Kuna.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm happy to be here on the panel as well. My name is Kwana Higgins, and currently I'm working with the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. I am the Acting Assistant for Regulatory and Tribal Affairs. So in my day job, though, when I'm not on detail, I am mostly on our civil works side. I did work for the Los Angeles District after I graduated. My background is civil engineering. But I focus on partnerships with tribal nations, so using our various federal authorities to help bolster the needs, and meeting the needs in tribal arenas. So yeah, thank you.
Aho, Nakano Natek, Nakajinwa Inwa Aquatic. My name is Mark Gilfellen. I come from the Sac and Fox of Missouri Reservation area in Kansas and Nebraska. That's where I got my start. I've worked with the Department of Energy, my own tribe, engineering firms, consulting firms, state work in environmental engineering, the Corps for 23 or so years. I've been a tribal liaison for many, many years in Sacramento District, and I see some of the people here that I know very well. It's good to see all your smiling faces. I have been working the last several years with the Tribal Nations Technical Center of Expertise. That's a resource nationwide from Alaska to Florida for all tribal nations and Maine to California. It just so happens to be housed in Albuquerque District, so I'm privileged to continue to be a Western person and do work in Indian country and take the core mission to Indian country. That's probably my passion, and that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
I'm Travis Hemmon. I'm the president of Westerfeld Ecological Services. We're one business unit of the Westerfeld Company. They're a timber company out of Alabama. They own and manage about 700,000 acres of timberland. And our little company, we've got 3 offices. We've done about 35,000 acres of restoration projects in about 7 states. And real quick, I'm interested in this because I think this question of long-term stewardship, ownership, monitoring has yet to be answered by this industry. And I hope this conversation leads to some of those answers.
Perfect. Great to have you all. Like I said, impressive, right? So last year, if you were here, there was a panel on tribal nations and how they participate in compensatory mitigation. And this is a different question from that. So this is other opportunities and avenues for tribes to participate in compensatory mitigation. But for a little bit of background, we know that tribes have established compensatory mitigation banks. Perhaps the most successful, and namely our Lumi Nation up in Washington, where their tribal bank is fully owned and operated on tribal land. And another one is a partnership bank with the Department of Transportation with Wisconsin and Oneida Tribe of Wisconsin. Theirs is a partnership. We know that tribes establish compensatory mitigation banks for different reasons and unique reasons to serve their tribal membership. What we don't know is what are the other opportunities that tribes can do to participate in this mitigation banking sphere. You know, not a lot of tribes have the resources, either a funding capacity or personal capacity, to be able to establish these compensatory mitigation banks on tribal land. If you know tribal land, it's very unique and sometimes very hard to deal with. A lot of tribes that are in this sphere, and tribes generally deal with like land fractionation, checkerboarding, that present a whole slew of unique issues. So we're going to turn it over to Travis to kind of talk about and highlight some of these opportunities that are available for tribes.
Yeah, and it's just impressive, just that introduction from Mariah, because I didn't know that she or they were working on efforts like that, like having tribes do banking and compensatory mitigation. And on the flip side of that, I was wrestling with, and our whole team has been wrestling with for probably the last 10 years, this concept of long-term stewardship and endowments, and who are the right people to sort of manage property, and what's the right funding stream, who are the right people to be involved. And I had this idea in my head because I had linked up with one of my old friends, Brian Zettel, who works at the Tribal Nations Tech Center, and he was talking about connecting tribes with restoration sites. And I thought, gosh, I need to answer this question though for ourselves, for our business, but really for the industry, is what's the right individuals involved in projects? And then when I talked to Mariah at a conference in Minneapolis, and she was explaining this effort of doing mitigation, in my brain I was thinking, why would the tribes want to do banking? It's terrible. I hate banking. It's very complicated, it's very technical, it's frustrating. I can't believe how frustrating it can be for tribes, but for us it's extremely frustrating. But what are some of the tribes really interested in? And it's access. I'm sorry, I get really emotional about this because giving them access to land is critical. And can we provide that as an industry? I mean, I know we have land, and if we can get the right people in the room, are we going to get the right people as long-term stewards? Monitors, is the right funding available? Is it the right scenario? And so since then, since Minnesota, and by the way, I cry a lot during these sessions, so be warned, but have had two now experiences with the Westerfelt Company supporting workshops related to keystone species. One was river cane in the southeast, and that was the Choctaw Nation. It was. The Choctaw Nation, connecting them with some sites that we had where we were doing river cane restoration. Learning from them. This spring we're going to have a listening session out there on one of our properties. Figuring out where that conversation goes, very exciting. Mark was out in Sacramento, and the Sac Core District and other entities in California got really excited to do a Thule workshop. So it was really exciting to hear the tribes that were interested in Thule. And I learned so much in that workshop about Thules, the importance of Thules. We have Thules. We've got a ton of Thules that they could have access to use for their education, for lessons, for art, for all of the aspects of their tribes. So I'm super excited about engaging in those conversations. And then ultimately, my thought is, there are three buckets. It's learning and educating each other at the right time on projects, monitoring and management potentially, and then the long term is potentially land ownership and or long-term stewardship. Because these properties are in perpetuity, and I've always struggled with the term in perpetuity because I'm probably only here for another 150 years. But in perpetuity is a long time, so who are the right individuals with the right attitude and the right approach to land to take care of this stuff that we're setting up? And so I'm just super excited about this conversation. We're going to see where it goes, but I can stop talking and have the other individuals talk. But anyway, I'm super excited. I think this is the right conversation at the right time for this industry, because long-term ownership and stewardship is always a question on the mind by the regulators, and it should be a question in our minds. So historically, 5 or 10 years was a long time. No, I'm talking 150, 200 years. That is in perpetuity, long-term thinking for these type of assets that we're setting up.
Great. Another thing I would like to add is looking from the tribal perspective. As I mentioned earlier, tribes often establish these projects and go into these partnerships for very unique reasons. So to expand on that, I mentioned Louis Nation and Oneida tribe. Oneida partnershiped on their mitigation bank because they wanted access to ceded lands. They didn't have the entire funding to buy those ceded lands, so the Department of Transportation actually went in on an agreement for them to buy the other half of the land, and when the monitoring period is up for that bank, the department will actually transfer full ownership of that land to the tribe, which is what they initially wanted. but they ended up getting restoration of their natural resources on their Aboriginal land as well. Lumi Nation, they wanted to streamline the permitting process for tribal members to build tribal housing on the reservation and also to do business economic development on their own reservation. However, even though tribes are not included in the policy, they still are subject to providing no net loss offsets to impacts that they create to natural resources. And what they decided to do was to create a mitigation bank and provide 100% discount on their credit to their tribal members who are doing housing on the reservation. And as you know, a sponsor sets the credit price and they can get those discounts. And so they were able to streamline that process for their tribal members, but also alleviate the financial burden to be able to develop housing and maybe develop hospitals, schools, and different things that are needed. So those are some of the unique reasons that tribes may want to engage in these partnerships. And so expanding on that, Travis mentioned a lot of times what cultural keystone species are, and without kind of really defining it, because all tribes are unique and they all have different definitions of what these things are, can you kind of expand on that, like what that is specifically and what it might look like for different tribes and that whole importance of it for tribes?
Why, yes, I can. Bottom line up front for those of us in the Corps, a cultural keystone species is whatever they want it to be, period. They'll have priorities different than ours as ecologists or plant people. So think about perspective for a minute. It's whatever they value that's integral to their culture. They may not even share that right away. Conversely, let me give you maybe a definition that most of us are familiar with, and I wrote a few things down. A cultural keystone resource or a keystone species is a plant, animal, or other natural resource that has greatly shaped the cultural identity of a people. A cultural keystone species often has an important role in their diet, their material, their culture, their medicine, and their spirituality. Keystone species can be an integral part of ritual, ceremony, language, and have links to kinships and oral traditions that are just sitting at the surface, waiting for that connection. And often that information is protected by the tribe and the pueblos and the nations. Some keystone species are going to be maybe taboo to even talk about in public. So it's that very centric part of tribal being and existence that's at stake with a cultural keystone species. A great example is salmon in the Northwest, chert deposits in New Mexico, river cane here in the Southeast. In the Midwest, we have other sacred plants we don't have access to. In the landscape, farming and ag practices have almost obliterated traditional cultural keystone species or sacred plants that are no longer obtainable. And then if you go out west, Thule was a great example of that plant species as a keystone species. But don't just limit it to what we think is in that realm of keystone species. It's really whatever the tribe decides. It's kind of like consultation. It's what they want it to be, not what we want it to be.
I have to know what chert is.
It's rock, man. It's
Okay.
how you.
It's rock. Fair enough. Okay.
Arrowhead.
Got it.
It's soil. It's
soil,
dirt.
okay,
Don't
it's
use
chert.
the term chert.
It's not
but
dirt,
chert,
it's
like
chert.
like obsidian, is the field point used on weapons and other utilitarian things that were used to open clams or shells or fire, right? So all of those things have synthesis and meaning and composition into a being and their way of life. And frankly, sometimes it's lost, and tribes in their role as THPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, are looking for ways to connect all of those things I just mentioned with a simple wetland mitigation bank access. But I want to take away this one last thing, if I may. Think about, and we'll probably talk about this with the governor, tribal priorities tend to be very narrow in their focus and perspective, right? What are their priorities? on reservation lands, on Pueblo lands, it looks unique for water allocation, wetland opportunities. As you expand that radius and their interest in ceded lands or historical territories, that interest changes and it wanes, and that might be a different interest factor that they're interested in connecting with for banks, with other agencies. So as you expand that radius from a tribal interest-centric point of view, it will change. So there are different opportunities and there are different priorities with the tribal government that they're going to have an interest. So it's interest factor based. Where is the sweet spot or the bullseye? And realize it will expand with that change of interest. Thank you.
Great. I'm glad he asked what that was, because I was sitting here like, I wonder what that is. But now we're going to turn it over to the governor. Could you please give us some examples about the importance of natural resources and wetland resources that have been to the Pueblo, and kind of some of the barriers that have been encountered in this area, like wetland restoration specifically?
Okay, well again, good afternoon again. So for Santa Clara Pueblo, our lands contain many natural materials and resources that continue to be of our day-to-day life, and again, the heart of the life-sustaining ecosystem for our people. Our lands is our spiritual sanctuary, an outdoor cathedral, a place of worship. These lands, contain our pharmacy, the medicinal plants, our grocery store from the deer, the elk to the fish, our clothing store, our hardware store, and most importantly is our biological classroom. So that's what's very important as we talked about traditional ecological knowledge and the connection to place, connection to landscape, connection to our language, our traditions, our culture. We still do our dances, we still speak our language. So it's very important that our mentors, which are our elders, the keepers of that knowledge, is very critical. So how do you interweave all those traditional ecological knowledge into forest, watershed management? Again, based upon the culture, the religion, the traditional activities, that must always be considered and interwoven into any land management activities, policies, statutes, regulations, which is very critical. Unfortunately for Santa Clara, back in the Second World War, Congress authorized a series of flood control projects along the Espanola section of the Rio Grande in the winter of 1955 and 1956. These projects massively reshaped the formerly meandering channel in an attempt to straighten the former floodplain. In addition to straightening the river, spoil bank levees and jetty jacks were constructed on both sides of the river in various locations. Again, this was to encourage and increase the velocity of the water within the river during high flows, thus limiting the potential for additional flooding impacts to agricultural fields, but also the inhabitants along the Rio Grande River. So what did that do? That cut off that water source to those wetlands already established. So now we're having to go back, working with the Corps of Engineers. So back in 2013, Santa Clara Pueblo and the Corps signed the very first cost-share agreement in the entire nation under the Corps Tribal Partnership Program for WARDA, Section 203 Comprehensive Water Resource Management Plan for the Pueblo. We've also established the Espanola General Investigation to determine how do we reconnect that Rio Grande River, because it incised over the years. So now you have the river, which is in size 10 feet higher than the original ground. So you have no more of that flooding. So all the cottonwood galleries are senescent, meaning they're dying out. So how do you connect that water source to the actual wetland, which is very important? So for Santa Clara, trying to enhance those wetlands is very critical for all these keystone species we're talking about, from the beaver to the bird to the waterfowl to the deer, the elk, but most importantly for the consumption of that water, for our traditional and cultural activities. So back in 1995, we have approved water quality standards for the actual consumption of all that water body, maybe the river, maybe surface water, maybe groundwater, maybe wetland. Again, as it relates to our traditional, cultural, religious activities and uses of that water source, which is very important. So again, having to go back and correct problems that happened in the past In 2023, we're still working on many of these issues, again, to sustain our livelihood of living off that land, which is very important. So all these non-governmental organizations, the philanthropic community, the federal agencies, the tribal partners is very critical so that you understand who your partner is. Again, we're all unique. We're not all the same. So whatever I'm expressing today may not be the same as the tribes in the East Coast, the West Coast, the North, which is very important. So having to come and visit your partner is very critical to understand how do you intertwine the traditional ecological knowledge into management and the uses. And so I knew, I think there's only 5 or 6 tribes that do have the water banking. But again, it's opportunity because those are larger land-based tribes. For Pueblos, we don't have the land base. So ours is to protect and enhance those wetlands for the future. But again, it's another opportunity. So how do we work on this to have that outreach, to try to capture more of the Pueblos, tribes, and nations to look at this because of the long-term stewardship, but also co-management, but how the conservation easements come into play, how do all these things, because it's our land. And we worked hard to preserve and protect our landscape for the future. It's not for us today. It's for the future generations to come. But again, it goes back to understanding your language, your history, your traditional ecological knowledge, and the uses of the landscape, which is very important. And for us in New Mexico and Santa Clara, we have checkerboard areas. So we have the Pueblo lands, but right within the Pueblo lands, we have private claims. We have the city of Espanola, we have the county. And unfortunately, a business owner constructed apartments, but what did he do? He constructed them on wetlands without having to go to the Corps to get a permit. So then the Corps came back to the Pueblo and said, Santa Clara, can we work together to reestablish another wetland along the Rio Grande River? We said, yes, we could, but in the Southwest, we are in drought. So how do you reestablish a wetland and connect that if the groundwater is not even going to sustain your wetland? So all that is very important. So there's all these challenges that we all have to face, but coming together, putting our minds together is very important, and we rely on the power of prayer, asking Creator for rain, for guidance, protection, for all of us. And we all come together as one, we will make many successes and extend these programs to fruition into the future. So I just want to express that for now. Okay? Thank you.
Yes, I do believe your voice is heard, Governor. It's, there are so many barriers and so many challenges to this sphere when tribes get involved. But what can we do about that? We're going to turn it over to Kwana to kind of talk about some of the avenues and things that are available in the Army Corps to kind of help tribes navigate this space, because it is very hard. And as you see, it's not something, as Governor mentioned, there's maybe 5 tribes that are either have a bank or are in a partnership bank or in the process of establishing these banks. And it's not something that's well known in the tribes or in the regulatory space. How do you work with these tribes? But we'll turn it over to Kwana for now to kind of talk about that.
Thank you, Mariah. And Governor, those were a lot of really good points in there. And honestly, where I hear the word barrier or the term challenges and things like that, I think, how can we turn this into an opportunity? Because like Mark, I was a tribal liaison for a while, and really trying to marry federal resources with tribal needs is really what I like to focus on. That's kind of my passion. What I continue to do in the policy realm for the next, 8 months, 9 months, something like that. So really where I see the opportunities is really marrying the indigenous knowledge or the traditional ecological knowledge with Western science. So in a way we can translate through technical services what tribes already know and what will work, what areas are right for using for these purposes, with getting the federal funding that they need to move forward. So I was going through, in preparation for this panel, as Mariah mentioned the Illumination, and so I looked up their business prospectus, right? What it took for them to set up their mitigation banking. And what I found out is that the Corps of Engineers, our Seattle district, actually did a planning assistance to states and tribes study back in 2000. So looking at this table of contents, all the information needed for them to set up their business plan, we're talking about existing land ownership. So we heard about that already today, about how that can be very challenging, and identifying not only the lands that are available that are either in trust or in fee, like is it private ownership, and then marrying that with, are these lands, this landscape actually useful for mitigation or restoration opportunities? A lot of the science and engineering, like the site topography, soils, the H&H, the hydrology, hydraulics, like how is the water moving across these lands? Doing the wetland delineations, wetland functional assessments, all of that going into conceptual design. So these are all things that I feel like the Corps of Engineers, either through Planning Assistance to States program, which now after WRDA, the Water Resources Development Act of 2022 has now opened that program up to be 100% federal for economically disadvantaged communities, and tribes actually, federally recognized tribes fall under that definition, right, for the administration. So between that and the Tribal Partnership Program has also been amended that the governor mentioned they worked. It has since expanded since those efforts. And now we can do technical assistance just like we could under Planning Assistance to States, but the Tribal Partnership Program was specifically set up by Congress to benefit or significantly benefit Indian tribes. So we may be able to take a little bit, further steps as far as pulling this information together for tribes with cost share breaks, because everything we do, unfortunately, is we're not a granting agency, unfortunately, but we can do partnerships. And I feel like that the Congress has been very supportive, and this administration is very supportive in trying to get tribes to the table to be partners and to meet their needs. So I feel like between a tribal partnership program and planning assistance to states, there's a lot of opportunities. Like, I don't want one of the barriers for tribes to be, we don't know how to get started. And if there's a way to partner with the Corps to get the information they need to get started, like there are avenues to do that. So I just wanted to emphasize that here today, that there are federal resources available for tribes to get started.
Yeah, definitely federal resources. So you've heard about there are opportunities. Tribes have done this owned and operated on their own, but there's also opportunities like what we're talking about here today in long-term stewardship, and who is the correct person or perhaps most available person to be able to do this entity, a tribe. They're perfect. They own the land prior to the 1940s and have been or the 1400s and have been doing traditional ecological knowledge since time immemorial, and really all they want is access to land, access to natural resources, access to culture, like what Governor is saying, and the importance of that. And so one of the questions I want to open up to the group is, as Kwana said, we don't want a barrier to be, access to information, and how do we get started? And so from your own perspective, each four of the panelists, what is the best way to approach these partnerships, not only between tribes and the Corps, but tribes and private mitigation bankers or these different federal agencies? Because that's not something that is easy to do. It's not easy for a tribe to approach anyone, and it's not easy for anyone to actually approach a tribe or a pueblo, especially in this space. So we'll start with Travis.
Sure. One thing I wrestled with early on in this concept was not confusing regulatory with just good conversation at the right time. So the 106 process is a process with a checklist, with timelines. I mean, that's a rigid regulatory process that has to get done. But that shouldn't be where the conversations truly take place, because they take time and they take a level of trust and communication with tribes. So, for us, I'm learning about when is the right time to communicate our restoration plan, our project plans, but also who to communicate with. So I know that Brian and Zettel and Mark and I are trying to figure out, okay, what is the communication tool to sort of get outreach, almost like a matchmaker for like restoration firms and tribes that are interested. That's really difficult, but I do believe we have to remove ourselves from the regulatory process and think of it more as the right conversation at the right time with a group of individuals that really care about the land. And we should care about that in terms of our thoughts on the long term. And so the whole big picture concept is you're trying to restore property back to where it was, and then you're also supposed to reconnect people that are going to do what's right for the landscape, long term. And the theory then is the land will be restored and healed much quicker and better if you have the right people involved. So for me, it's really the right time to connect, or trying to figure out the right time to connect, not too early so you're not wasting time, but early enough so they really feel engaged and you're not just baking them a cake and say, here, please eat this, we're done. That's not gonna work. But I do think getting your mindset out of what can I get through the regulatory process with this program for, that's not the right way to do it. It's good neighbor, good connection, early connection. And so I'm still trying to figure out the template for that for our company, but I think it's really important is when you have the conversation, then who to connect with.
And I guess I want to, like I mentioned, is learning who your partners are. Visit them, go to their land, go see them where they live at, explore the options. And again, I go back to traditional ecological knowledge, going back to now the new, not new term to us, but nature-based solutions, engineering with nature. All those are the things that the Pueblos, tribes, and nations have been doing since time immemorial. You know, and integrating traditional ecological knowledge can prove cost-effective when materials can be sourced locally, thus reducing procurement and transportation costs, has an ecological value as methods are typically based on a naturally occurring process, again, culturally sustainable, since TEK provides a method for developing resilience to both cultural and ecological resources. Unfortunately, Santa Clara Pueblo in 2011 was hit by the Las Conchas fire. At that time was the largest wildfire in New Mexico history. So we had to incorporate, because our Santa Clara Creek was devastated, the hydrology, everything, we're back to square one now. But because we developed a naturalistic approach to watershed restoration and management that integrated traditional ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge, you know, Santa Clara Pueblo received the first place for the EPA Region 6 Outstanding Green Infrastructure Low Impact Design Award, Engineering Excellence Award from the Army Corps of Engineers, or the American Council of Engineering Companies, best practice referrals by FEMA, the Nature Conservancies, and others. And we had a number of publications with engineering with nature principles in the Corps of Engineers, but also through FEMA. So these are very important. As I mentioned, as traditional ecological knowledge becomes increasingly knowledgeable, or knowledge as a valid form of landscape management, we look forward to promoting the techniques we identified while also innovating and developing new forms of TEK to be more effective managers of our natural and cultural resources. So that's what's very important, understanding that. And again, one of the challenges that we do see, as was mentioned, was the cost share. Many tribes, pueblos, and nations aren't wealthy financially, but we're wealthy with our traditions, our culture, our religion, and our language. So that's more valuable of how we interact with the landscape, which is very important. So understanding who your partner is and how do you put their livelihood into your program, into your assessments, into your plan is very critical. And it's proven to show that it's success for all of us. So that's what's very important as we move along. The critical element is knowing your partner and understanding where we come from and who we are. And don't fight them, but understand them. Thank you.
Okay.
And I would build off of what the governor so eloquently expressed. Let me hearken back to a cultural keystone resource that I think he is very familiar with, and that's acequias. Reconnecting the floodplain with the river system. And acequias were that water delivery system that was used to help manage the floodplain. Mm-hmm. But that's an incredible resource. We may not think of it in such a way, but the tribe and the Pueblos do. So always remember, it starts with what they want, their priority. What is, as you listen, my grandmother would tell me I was given 2 ears and 1 mouth. I should always be doing twice as much listening. But as you engage and you listen, you'll hear the priorities and the needs. Then you can start addressing how to approach and engage tribes with what tool set you have in your box, right? Us as federal agencies, I'll just say, if you're engaging for Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act only with tribes, you're doing it wrong, right? They need so much other. They need cultural, yes, but natural resources are a whole different bailiwick of opportunities. So that extends not only to banks, mitigation projects, restoration projects, but in a larger concept, the co-management opportunity that exists within all of our thousands and 11 million acres of core federal-owned lands built by civil works and operations and main stem systems, lakes, dams, levees, locks, we can just go dikes, on and on and on. All of that is the access to natural-based systems and things that are key to tribes, right? Sometimes banks can engage effectively without the agency. Maybe we can match make. Here's our point of contact. It looks like this. But often, to be successful in that arena for-profit banking partnerships is for the regulator, the agency, to get out of the way. We connected, we get out of the way. Let that partnership organically develop. Conversely, let me throw something else at you. Law enforcement, capacity for tribes to build cultural resource protection on many of our operation sites, our levees, our reservoirs, are things that continue to grow tribal capacity upwards when they can expand law enforcement, they can expand their biology department, they can expand monitoring opportunities. And sometimes we can help lift that to a level where they can participate effectively. Is the Corps the right one-stop shop for all tribal needs? Absolutely not. Seldom can we meet stem to stern all of their needs. Sometimes we have to have our own partnership with other agencies. Many other partnerships can help bridge that gap to bring in an effective solution to Indian country. I've had the privilege of many years of going in Indian country and looking at how that paternalistic viewpoint of the federal government is the only one that can meet your needs. You see schools, you see things that were built that were left and said, we're done, we're washing our hands, we're walking away. And a tribe never wanted it. It's in disrepair, it's obsolete, it's a mausoleum. So the perspective is, if they want it and you listen, you'll find the solution that meets their needs. But don't just hand them the permit, the project, the solution you think they need. It's not always welcome. It doesn't serve their need, but be advised, right? It might have met a need 50 years ago or 40 years ago, but things change. Tribal priorities change. Their capacity changes. What they wanted 20 years ago is completely different now. But the land stewardship and connection to co-management of natural resources, fish, game, is huge. And don't forget the fact that as you expand the radius of interest out into ceded lands, many tribes have tremendous ceded land areas where they can't exercise a right, a usufructuary right, the right to hunt, fish, and collect plants for their customs and traditions. They're looking for that opportunity in ceded lands where nearby banks, they're nearby operations. So those are the way tribes think and consider their priorities. How can we exercise our right away from the reservation? Maybe it's on the reservation, that's great, but think of the land areas that were diminished, that they still have rights on, that they can no longer exercise. They're looking for that opportunity.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in one quick thing. And I think this, though, highlights the importance of setting up these projects correctly. And we've all learned, I think, over the last 5 or 6 years how critical long-term funding is. And I'm very California-centric. I do think they do it correctly. I think they have evaluated that long-term stewardship cost, and they're now applying those to both banks and restoration sites. But that's the right way to do it, because you don't want to leave a liability on the landscape if you ever have to leave that property as a manager. And so Westerfelt sees that as an insurance policy. It's why we set our projects up with pretty robust endowments, because we know if for some reason we couldn't be around, we need the correct babysitter with the right amount of money that sees this as a benefit to them. And that's why I'm excited to engage the tribes that are interested in our properties, from monitoring or management, potentially ownership, because we have this bucket of money set up correctly. And again, I believe the industry has grown and learned from that, but that's why it's so critical for all of us to not just think about the pro forma and the small amount of endowment. It has to be the right endowment for these assets.
Good point.
Sorry. Microphone malfunction. All right, so I just want to piggyback really quick before we move on to another question on, underscoring some of the things that Mark has said, because I think what we're seeing happening in the federal government, or at least within the Corps of Engineers, is this culture shift of away from these transactional type engagements with tribal nations, because the only interactions most of the time the federal government has with tribal nations is saying, oh, well, we might be impacting and having an adverse effect on you. So instead of only going to tribes when we need them to say yes to maybe a partnership we have with like a city, a county, or, Department of Ecological Resources or something from a state, more so like when you do have those consultations, the government to government consultations, typically what is shared in those meetings isn't just the information we need from the tribes, but they're actually telling us what they need from a bigger picture standpoint. So instead of being transactional to say, hey, tell us how this impacts you and what you want in return, and just making it very transactional, actually listening and then trying to, again, like I said earlier, marry those needs with federal resources, because we have other, outside of these specific projects, avenues to address, needs within the tribe. So, yeah, I guess the cross-functional thing also, when you're out there consulting, you may be on one project and it's focused on 106, or it might be focused on NAGPRA. It might be focused, insert law here, right?
Talk about IIS, your ability to partner.
Yeah. But yeah, those cross-functional needs, because the Corps, I don't know if, I know we have Corps people in the audience, but we're very siloed, right? Like we're very in our own functions, and what happens in regulatory stays in regulatory. What happens, in the Corps Civil Works Planning stays in Corps Civil Works Planning. But what really happens in those conversations when you're focused on partnerships, right, and building that relationship, is finding the needs and getting those resources met. But yeah, to expand on what Mark just mentioned, we do have another authority, and it's actually using other federal funding for tribes. We can use the Chiefs Economy Act, and that's under our interagency and international support services. So it's something where we can use other federal funds to do projects. And typically this has been done to build like cultural resource centers and just other needs that may get brought up during these consultations for other projects. Schools, I know we've used BIA funding to build schools. Quapaw Nation, I know we have a fire department, right? We built all of that for them. So yeah, I'm excited about all the different partnering opportunities we have, and it's not just specific to why just compensating for environmental degradation. It's more like holistic picture.
And I'll throw one more thing out there. Partnerships in our mindset today is kind of a new flavor of the week, flavor of the month initiative. We performed some listening sessions in the Midwest in Oklahoma, and many tribes there are still back a ways and aren't ready to embrace partnerships just yet, because our agency isn't in full compliance with the law, whether it's NAGPRA, ARPA, or other concerns that tribes have culturally. They're not ready to embrace the Corps with our partnership initiatives just yet, because we haven't been fully compliant with the law. And that is still where the rubber meets the road for many tribes. When you get the law right, then we'll entertain we'll entertain partnerships and these nice things, but we're still back here going, we're still upset for X, Y, and Z that you haven't correctly addressed. So just be aware, if you're engaged with tribes and you hear, or nations that are maybe tentative about partnerships, and they bring up aspects of compliance of the law, they're still not ready to engage fully this way. They're still like compliance here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything. I don't have to agree, but I agree with everything of what they're saying. These partnerships are hard. They're based off historical injustice in every which kind of way that, tribes can go through. And how do you approach it? I think they've answered in a very eloquent way on giving some ideas on how to approach tribes in this sphere. And one thing I want to ask, now that we have kind of more of an approach from different perspectives, is what does co-development on these partnerships actually look like in this sphere? And is there anybody that wants to take that question first?
You bet. Giving tribes, pueblos, and nations a seat at the table from the beginning. That's the key. If you do that and let them sit in and from design to engineer to construct, and they're integral in the whole process, you'll find that partnership and how they want to be involved. Too often, they're not involved at the table from the beginning, from design, scope, construct and build, and it's sad, but it's relational and it's revelatory when a tribe is asked to participate and be at the table from the beginning, because they're invested. They'll provide the TEK. It's a value and exchange or transactional concept, right? Maybe you won't find the traditional knowledge until you've had that relationship and partnership over time. They're not willing to give up the last remaining things they hold sacred until they're ready and they've watched you enable them to participate at the table from the beginning. If you just want to show up and extract information from a nation and then go out and build your own project, you'll get silence and it won't be participatory.
One thing because I'm pretty guarded when it comes to the mitigation industry in terms of what we deliver. And so the thing that and this may sound negative, but I don't want tribes that have landscapes to be confused on a bank and crediting of banks, because these programs, the program of mitigation credits or compensatory mitigation, they're for permanent offsets. So I think it's good technical consulting and advice back from the agencies whether it really works or not. If it doesn't work for compensatory mitigation or a bank, let people know quickly, especially tribes and their consultants, let them know. And maybe there's a different program that can restore a piece of property, but don't put credits in the market that aren't really good for the offset program. And a lot of times, and not just tribes, I deal with farmers all the time that say, Travis, please make me a bunch of credits. I hear it's really simple. Well, guess what? It's already wetlands and you're never going to get credits from it, and I'm sorry, we'll go figure out something else. But you have to get that information early before people get too invested in a project. And so I think making sure the partnership is good technical communication back on landscapes on what works for the program and what doesn't work for a compensatory program is really, really critical.
And again, for Santa Clara, we will always continue to maintain a connection to that landscape, which is on or off reservation. So for Santa Clara, we're surrounded by the Santa Fe National Forest, by the Valles Caldera National Park. We have BLM lands, we have state lands, we have city lands, we have private claim lands. However, even though they were unfortunately taken from us back in the day, we still have the connection to that landscape, which is very important. So part of my challenge the past 3 or 4 years was getting a co-management agreement through what they call the self-governance, through the Department of Interior. So again, Santa Clara is only one of 5 or 6 tribes in the entire nation that has a self-governance funding agreement with the Park Service, which is the Valles Caldera. And last year we did the Bandelier National Monument because of that connection to that landscape, which is very important. So these lands contain traditional cultural property, sites of importance. These sites are place-based. So once they're destroyed, damaged, they're lost forever. We can't replicate them, we can't move them. So it's very important that the tribes will tell you that we cannot do a project in this area because it's culturally sensitive, which is very important. But again, insects, disease, knows no boundaries, so it's very important that we treat the landscape, but look at the precious water. Water is life. So how do we protect that if it's for creation of wetlands, to enhance them, but also water source, which is very important. And so the ways of living off the land, as I mentioned, is not for us, but it's a teaching to our children. So our children need to understand the connection to place. connection to land, connection to habitat. So it's a holistic approach, which is very important, so that the children understand where they come from, who they are, how to use that land. But again, it's very critical through the songs, the prayers, that we were taught to also respect that, which is very important. Again, so that children remember that connection to those landscapes. And one of the things, unfortunately, through the Las Conchas fire, at that time I worked as a forestry director, we had to implement the National Disaster Recovery Framework, an NDRF, because there are so many federal agencies, state agencies, non-governmental organizations, the internal public departments that worked on and still working on the short, mid, and long-term restoration activities, mitigation activities, but also costs, also revenue, also funding, also agreements. So that was a challenge that I had to undertake, but again, we have nowhere else to go. So having to work on home is very critical, so I had to understand all the federal existing authorities and what do they mean, and it wasn't duplicating efforts. So I put together a Las Conchas team where I brought all those federal agencies, the state agencies, because I couldn't meet with BIA one day, Forest Service the next, the Park Service the next, NRCS the next, the state, the city. I brought them all into one room like we're doing now. I said, okay, what do you bring to the table? What is your funding source? Is there a cost match? How can I use yours to offset with a philanthropic community, a non-governmental? How do we work on the wetland? How do we work on the creek? How do we work on the habitat? How do we work on the watershed? Which is very important. So you bring that plan together, then you start to identify a point of contact, identify how their funds are going to be broken down into phases. So maybe Interior had money to do a plan. Now the Corps had another to do the design. Now you have the non-governmental that could do the construction. But after that, you have to do monitoring. And so all that is very important, which is very challenging. And a lot of the tribes are very small that don't have that workforce. So developing that workforce is very critical, but that's where we need scientists, where we need hydrologists, where we need consultants, because we still got to follow the law. We can't get around the law. So I've been advocating, going back to Washington, on how do we streamline these statutes, these laws and regulations, which is going to be very important to be flexible. I don't want to have anyone go to jail or to prison, but let's try to bend it. Let's try to massage it to get the best flavor out of that to support all of our activities, which is very important. But that's a true relationship and partnership that's successful, and we've done that there in Santa Clara. So it's very important to understand your partner, which is very important moving forward. And again, all the work we do today, it's not for us. It's for the future generations that are yet to come. That's what we're doing it for the wildlife, for the plants, for an entire landscape, which is very critical. So I also invite you guys to come out to New Mexico. If you've never been to New Mexico, we're about 2 hours north of Albuquerque. We're in north central and northern New Mexico. We're only like 8 miles north of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. So there's all these challenges that the tribes face, from unfortunate situations during the Manhattan Project, that's where the atomic bomb was built. You know, so we're still facing the contamination, but also education, transportation, housing. There's so many challenges, and just one, which is water, is very critical for all that in a holistic approach. But just thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned, plans, collectively, making sure we're on the same page. Really very specifically and technically, our projects generally have long-term management plans. So my entitlement folks are going to kill me with the statement. However, that would be a great place to memorialize TEK species, discussions with the tribe, collection methods, potentially even discussions of access for ceremony, in those long-term management plans. And then maybe ultimately, if we have early enough buy-off that a tribe could sign on to a long-term management plan, or even a bank or a restoration site, which would be the ultimate. That would take a lot of extra care, communication, but it also might provide us with a lot more knowledge of the site long-term for us using in the future. So these long-term management plans are actual documents, but really engaging the right tribes on the right property to discuss some of those really key elements in a document that we would all jointly agree on and then potentially sign.
And I kind of look at that as a recovery support strategy. You know, because you're trying to recover, right?
Yeah.
So you're putting that plan together for the short, mid, and long term. So how do you do that? Working together, and it can be done. We got to sit at the table early on, often, from the start to the end, and then as we go into the future. So that's very important, because that's where the tribes get mad, because they're not called to the table up front. They're always here, shove it, take it. We can't take it. We got to be part of the solution, you know, which is very important. So you have your tribal nation at the table at the beginning. They're going to help you, because they also want you to be successful, and they also want to be successful, which is very important.
Well, I mean, think of his comments several times about generational interests, that this isn't about us, right? This is about grandchildren. That's what a long-term management plan is. It's a babysitting Bible for a piece of land that's going to be used to oversee a property. And we need that insight and really that approach to it, which is exactly the approach he mentions, which is this is about generations beyond us, for sure.
Yep, some really good insight about opportunity and generational approaches. So you've heard, you know, what are some of the opportunities for tribes to participate in this sphere, and how do you get to those opportunities, the what and the why? You know, you want partnerships that are real and that are lasting, and maybe mending old historical injustices on each side and misunderstandings. And some very good insight provided on that today. You know, this whole thing is about opportunity, and how do you take care of the natural resources collectively, with tribes in the equation versus exclusively, you know, only going through the regulatory process. And, you know, tribes are a necessary piece of this puzzle. You know, they need to be at the table in order to help. They want to help, but like many regulators, they don't know the proper questions to ask and the proper way to approach these partnerships. So, you know, I think what we've heard today is you got to start somewhere. And where can you start? You can start with long-term management of resources and natural resources that are culturally significant to tribal nations. You know, as I mentioned before, not all tribes are for developing mitigation banks. Maybe they don't have the land base, maybe they don't have the funding, maybe, you know, whatever the slew of reasons is, but they can participate in this market and do it effectively through partnerships and through long-term management and stewardship and what have you. So one last question I want to ask our panelists, because all of these perspectives are going to be different, is if you could focus on one area about this process in a short answer that needs training for tribes to get in this sphere, what would it be from your perspective?
Mark's going to start, I could tell.
Oh, I'm going to segue up.
Oh, well, sorry. I'll say
The governor will start.
educational outreach, because this is new to me. I had to go back and do research and what is marketing, what is credits, what is banking. I didn't know nothing of that. But again, it's all going back to common sense, right? How do you restore, how do you enhance, but what do you use that for? So again, all that is very critical, but educational outreach for tribal tribes and nations is very important, not just with the federal agencies, but also the banks, the creditors, so that we all understand how do we formalize that partnership. Because eventually, like for Santa Clara, we have a corporation. So part of the corporation, we have a small hotel, a casino, a golf course, but there's also, we want to diversify our economic portfolio, but how do you do that when you're gonna maybe damage a wetland? So how do you do that internally, which is very important. But then you have the downstream users from Albuquerque, you have Intel down in Albuquerque, you have Santa Fe, so eventually maybe some of those folks might want to see what Santa Clara can do upstream to support them in their credits. But that's something new to us that we just began the discussion about 3 weeks ago with the Corps to get a better understanding of not just the river, the Rio Grande, but also the Santa Clara Creek, which is also important. So all that is going to be very important. So I would say at least educational outreach to the Pueblos, tribes, and nations.
All right, and I guess I'm going to take the opportunity to say it again, right? Like the worst thing I can see happening is that tribes that are interested in this aren't able to get it going because maybe lack of data, or you know, just getting that data down on paper, getting it modeled and things like that. So there are different programs. I mean, the Corps has a few tools in their toolbox as far as, you know, appropriations and money that we could bring to the table and technical expertise. But yeah, I guess I would want to focus on getting the resources to tribes where we can, and making sure we unlock that funding to help them move forward.
I'm going to use a different word. I'm going to use the word relationship rather than outreach or education. Relationship means you're risking something. Outreach and education doesn't necessarily mean that. Relationship to me means, as an agency representative, I'm invested in the outcome with a partner. I can educate and outreach all day long, brochures, pamphlets, and have no investment, right? I'm one and done. But a relationship is what a tribe is looking for. They're very suspicious about me, Quanah especially. But we bring baggage. We bring bad actions. We have actions in our history that we've forgotten about, but the tribes haven't. So they want a relationship before they want anything else. What do you look like? They're going to analyze you. I learned in a unique way of storytelling. I had questions. People didn't give me answers in my eldership. They gave me stories. I'm like, well, that doesn't answer the question. It does. It's relationship. I'm invested in continually learning and observing with them. Then they'll get to answering the question. So realize relationship is where things start, and as you progress in this relationship, education, outreach comes along, opportunities, funding, all those things, but you're really in it for relational reasons rather than education or outreach, which can be one and done and sometimes is seen too quickly, right? It's too fast. I want to get to know who this person is. What do you stand for? What are your passions? So I'll say that much. Thank you.
Yeah, mine is, I worry a little bit about funding towards the trying to technically teach people how to do this crazy banking thing, because then I think you need to take like depression medication after that or something, because it's just very hard. And so, but I do like, I mean, I appreciate the technical wanting to support that effort, and there's a lot of technical people really in this conference that could probably support some of those efforts if tribes are interested in making that connection with technical people that do sort of compensatory mitigation type projects. But I really loved the funding that came with the workshops for connecting. We did these 2 pilot projects, River Canaan, Thule, and it wasn't a whole lot of funding, but that funding allowed us, and anybody was invited, but Department of Water Resources and Corps of Engineers staff, and they all came, and we all got to meet people we hadn't met in the restoration community and tribal nation representatives. It was great. I would love to do more of those across the country, get funding for that, because that's where it starts, is these listening sessions and workshops, you know, they started with a prayer. They got really emotional. I think I cried 3 times at it. But it was awesome to sit in a room for 2 full days, listen to stories about Thule, the importance of Thule, and then meet people face to face that were tribal representatives that wanted to hear about our Thule projects. We took them then to one of our projects that we did, a giant garter snake project that actually has a lot of Thule. They were excited. They were sharing their knowledge about how they transplant Thule. It helped some of our restoration guys. That type of funding wasn't all that much, but it meant tons, because now, since that workshop, we've probably had 25 different calls, meetings, emails on other projects we're doing in the Sacramento area from tribes that were interested, and that's going to help our project. So that's where I'd love to see more funding. If I could advocate for Mark and Brian Zettel, those are really critical workshops.
Grassroots-based.
Grassroots, yep.
Definitely. And to tie it in, you know, relationships, partnerships, and to bring it back to Governor, you know your partner, know the tribe, go out, ask them. You don't know until you ask. They're all completely unique. There's 574 of them. Good luck. But, and Pueblos are different, you know, they're different from the lower 48, as they're different from Alaska Native corporations, and are different from the Pueblos. They're, you know, all completely unique. And so I just want to thank our panelists for coming and enlightening us on this topic. It's not something you ever really hear about. It's not something you really think about, because you think of mitigation banking and think of, where do tribes belong in that puzzle? Have they done it? Yes, they have. But what are the other opportunities for them outside of this, and how can there be mutual benefit in this space for both tribes and the regulators and private mitigation bankers to restore natural resources for longevity. And so thank you guys for coming today and enlightening everybody about this. And I hope to see more partnerships come from you guys and come from, them and more tribes, more Pueblos, more Alaska Native corporations, because, essentially you guys are all one big puzzle and all a needed piece in that puzzle, no matter how much you want to fight it. So don't fight each other.
We have 6 minutes. If there are questions,
Yeah, if there are questions,
I would
we'll
love
open it up.
someone to hear me talk more. So go ahead.
Just wondering if you can speak to, the regulatory government support of access to, these mitigation banks. You spoke to it a little bit, but a lot of the ones I've interacted with, it's like, here's the bank, there's all of the monitoring and management, but otherwise people don't go there. So just kind of where's the regulatory and government support to make that accessible?
So, my situation might be a little bit different because Westervelt is a landowner, and I almost hate to use the term ownership. It sounds wrong. It's really stewardship, but we physically, fee title own something like 750,000 acres. Our company is interested in allowing access to tribes because we believe in the hypothesis that reconnecting those individuals that care about the land will benefit the land. Now, when it comes to other mitigation banks that might not have that fee title ownership, then yeah, there should be maybe some support from the Corps allowing or letting people be encouraged to go out on sites, but that's a little outside of it.
And maybe to answer your question a little more specifically, from some of these listening sessions that are supported through Engineering with Nature, other funds, we've been able at the Technical Center of Expertise build map viewers, number one, that show the relational overlay of tribal lands and ceded lands with where this resource of mitigation banks looks at and looks like, as well as a database, a very simple one, of sharing information at the lowest level, right, organically. What kind of access is available? What kind of plants? And what species do you have? Can we transplant it and move it from A to B to our site or help implement? So this database and map viewer are just very simple things to kind of find that interest-based component of the resource and the right partners that have that. So if I can answer it that way, it's the best way I know how.
And I think to add to that, is we've heard, tribes are very place-based in where they are. They're, a lot of them are regional, especially historically. And when they got put on reservations, a lot of land was ceded and checkerboard and fractionated, and so they're place-based. But a lot of the, mitigation banking is very land-based. And so one of the things is marrying those up for a tribe to meet their own interests that, as I mentioned, are sometimes not in the interest of actually creating a mitigation bank. Like, you take the Illumination, their interest was they wanted to develop housing. And so kind of marrying that with regulations and how do we create something legally defensible for our own membership and to meet our own interests is, kind of a short answer as well.
Yeah, one example of that is this southeast project. It's River Cane. We have a Tuckabum Creek, sorry about the name Tuckabum, but it's really important to the Choctaw Nation who are up in Oklahoma, and super excited to hear about access and obtaining access to River Cane again. And they got involved because we were doing a project and it was for ALDOT, and ALDOT was doing a major project, Highway 43, but it was very political and it needed to get its permits, so the Corps is stressed out, they're trying to get things done, and it was very hard to do 106 through all that. But it was just ironic that we had this conversation and we were able to sort of reach the Choctaw Nation outside of 106 and just invite discussion, invite conversation, learn more about it, make sure the Corps is getting their permits out because they were under a lot of pressure to get a permit out for a major project. That's a lot of stress. But we wanted to just continue the conversation. And so since then, now we're actually going to have them out on our site so they can actually show us reasons why it's important, River Cane is important to them. But that's a great example. They're displaced from that area historically in the Alabama area, and they're going to get a chance to reconnect to that, which we think is really important.
Hi, so thank you for this panel. I learn every year when I come to this panel. So I'm with Bureau of Land Management, and I think you may have may have mentioned it indirectly, but there's the joint secretarial order between the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture that Deb Holland and I think Doug Vilsack signed, encouraging co-stewardship of the lands. And so that was fairly recent. And there is a little report out. I need to read that. I didn't have time before I got here. But one of the things that our folks, I work at headquarters, one of the things our folks in our Nevada State office brought up was that they wanted to put something in place. We have been setting up some of these mitigation funds for certain resources like greater sage grouse or lands with wilderness characteristics. But we were thinking about perhaps we can find an appropriate mitigation fund holder and set up a mitigation fund to that folks with impacts to cultural resources can pay into. And then the thought was that, and I think this they had, I wasn't directly involved, but I think that they must have been talking with some of the tribes or tribal members, because one of the things that they wanted these funds to go to was for tribal members to do monitoring and management of lands associated with, I think, existing mines that are up there and potentially new projects happening too. I think it was mines, maybe wind and solar. I can't remember now. It could be all of the above. But I think that co-stewardship joint secretarial order is something that we really need to look at and really take advantage of. So going forward,
I'm glad you brought that up. As a major federal landowner with cultural resources under the law of ARPA, right? How can you invest in monitoring, law enforcement, and protection of those resources and include tribes at the same time? I think you can. That co-stewardship and cooperative management capacity for remote sensing is huge. So just continue to keep traction on that and work with tribes, because they're just as interested in protecting the cultural natural resources in their lifeways as the agency is. Maybe more so. It's their resource.
And last month I was out in Washington, D.C. We got invited by the Biodiversity Funders Group. It's a philanthropic non-governmental organization, and that's what they're looking at right now. So you have all these philanthropic communities, non-governmental organizations that never work with tribes. So now they're challenging each other to work with tribes, and now I think they set up like $20-some million to do direct funds to the tribes for co-management. Because again, a lot of these federal funds come with a cost match, but you use their money, which is then tribal money, to meet that 50 or 25% cost match, which then leverages that dollar and grows it 2, 3, 5 times. And so that's what's very important. And so through the Interior or BIA stuff, it's Public Law 93638, which is an actual contract, which is very important because that provides that money directly to the tribes to then do that monitoring, to then build their internal capacity, the workforce development on or off the public lands or tribal lands, which is very critical because they know the land. Then you have your tipple. So many of us have forestry programs. We do hazardous fuel reduction projects. Interior and USDA has the Tribal Forest Protection Act. So that's also critical, where you can use that money to leverage a lot of these important long-term stewardship but co-management, which is very critical. Then recently came out the executive order on environmental justice. So that's also important, how all that ties in together because of the uniqueness of the landscape. But again, you have different agencies managing our Aboriginal lands, which still have those traditional cultural values, which is very important. So having that holistic landscape level is very critical moving forward.
So yeah, you know, we at BLM are really trying to promote bank sponsors coming in and doing mitigation conservation banks on BLM managed lands. And that is something that could be done in coordination with tribes that traditionally had those lands and want want more access to those lands and things too. So I think there's a big opportunity there. So you wouldn't necessarily be the banker, but you would be working with the bankers, a partner.
Just while I had a inspired thought, we've talked a lot about, my name is Josh Gilman. I work for a private consultancy. We talked a lot about how relationships is really the foundation, it's cornerstone. It's kind of awkward, we come in here and we're like, hey, we need something from you tribes. That's a really weird way to come about it, but I like what you were talking about, those programs and building that internal infrastructure. It will strengthen advocacy, and I'm a firm believer that, until we understand our indigenous perspectives on our natural resource, we can't really restore it for the right reasons, and that runs deep in my ethos of doing the right thing for the right reason. So I feel like, kind of in a circular format, coming with our hat in our hands and maybe bringing some of the program funding and empowering our indigenous people to restore our understanding of relationship with the ecosystem is really imperative to get to where we're going. Otherwise, we're just going to run around and do transactions and do business and, I'll take this and I'll give you that, and that's not really where long-term stewardship lies. It's a mindset and a paradigm, that we need to embrace. And I think that our indigenous communities are not an important part, but a critical, mandatory piece of that. So just sharing.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old, so I used to listen to Paul Harvey, The Rest of the Story. And I have long said, what is the rest of the story for the restoration industry? And I truly believe that the tribal nation connection is a huge piece of that rest of the story for us.
Yes, I think we have one more question, and then we are over time, so we'll have to meet separately.
You can buy me a beer later
Yeah.
if you want to talk more.
Yeah, this is probably just what we call a parking lot issue. It might just be an idea for further conversation, and great panel, by the way. And a theme is to reach out early, which we haven't been good at in the past. Our earliest point in the process typically is going to be site selection, and a lot of us feel like for the best ecological outcome, you have to do a really good job picking the most suitable site. And so I think there's really a role to reach out as early as site selection in certain cases to tribal nations. And so that's something that I think we started touching on, Mark. I think you talked a little bit about it, but that'd be an exciting thing to talk about, is how do we get input to this site selection process that we all go through. And so anyway, that's all I've got.
Thanks.
I just want to mention one of the unique things about site selection in these tribal banks is they often do the wetland delineations and choose the sites that are actually have more probability to restoring a lot of their own cultural and natural resources that they use. And so I think that would be, if not even before that, a really good stage to kind of engage the tribe on, especially if you're going to do something like restore their cultural keystone species for them, which is, as Travis mentioned and Governor mentioned, we're often displaced from the ceded lands and different things, and it's much needed. So, yeah.
I really needed to hear this last
Okay,
question.
one more.
She's from Colorado, so.
Okay.
I don't know, I may open a can of worms. I'm with the Army Corps, and I have a question on funding, and if that conflicts with the 2008 rule in the funding when something's federally funded that can't be used for mitigation that's then sold. Have you considered that? And I mean, I'm sure you have. So how does that work around when you want to help a tribal nation actually do a bank that they would then sell for credits?
It's a great question. I want to hear them answer that, but I was kind of thinking that, so now I'm curious.
Yeah, so that actually gives me an opportunity to clarify, right? So when I say we have federal funding and programs available to help tribes, I mean, we only went so far as to provide technical assistance for data purposes, right? Pulling information together, filling in the data gaps. But, you know, the illumination, that was very specific, very unique, and it had a whole federal Puget Sound task force associated with it. So it had like a specific political energy behind it, and the approval of that mitigation bank, I mean, it's not something I don't know that we can specifically replicate because of like the political pressures behind that. But, you know, as far as using our technical services and the funding that we have available, at least through the Corps, you know, we provide technical services to tribes that ask for it. Now, if they come to us and say, can you help us set up a mitigation bank? The answer is probably not, right? Now, the information that they need to do that, we could do that in the spirit of ecosystem restoration. So identifying these sites, the characteristics of the lands, and like the type of restoration that we can do, that's about as far as we can go, right? And then we got to draw the line. So thank you for letting me clarify that.
And I guess that's why I go back to that recovery support strategy. So how do you use the core funds to start a project? How do you go back to Interior? How do you go to NRCS? How do you go to Fish and Wildlife? How do you go to an NGO, a philanthropic community, and tribal funds? And this is why that Public Law 93638 funding Title I is very critical, because that money is given to the Pueblos where now I can use as cost match. So now you leverage funding from the Corps. You leverage money from other agencies because that's we challenged that and we won. So now that 93638 contract dollar that I get, I can use to cost match other programs. So all that is very important, but the main key element also is those non-governmental organizations and philanthropic communities. So there's so many out there, which are you, can come to our aid and support each other. And that's how we leverage, and again, not duplicating efforts, but creating that phased approach so we get from cradle to grave, I guess you call it, from the start to the end, which is very important. We gotta think outside of the box and be very creative. And we put all our minds together, we will be successful. We can't let them always say, it doesn't matter, the challenges, obstacles through laws, statute, regulations, we can overcome that, and we think and be creative in a successful manner for all of us. We're all in here together. And that's a true team and a true partnership and a true collaboration. It's not I, it's we, it's us and all. And that's what makes us all successful.
I think to piggyback off that too, to answer your, partly answer your question specifically, I looked at this and, you know, really researched illumination, and you're right, you know, you can't fund a for-profit mitigation project with federal funds. And so where does that funding come from for a tribe? And this is something we kind of hit on earlier is, you know, mitigation banking to this level might not be for a tribe, but the most successful examples we have are Illumination and Oneida Nation. Oneida Nation did not fund their mitigation bank. The Department of Transportation did. They just had this specific interest in getting their ceded lands back for whatever that reason was. We may never know. But they achieved that through partnerships. Whereas Illumination, you know, I think it took about $5 million for them to be able to develop the first phase of their mitigation bank, because their bank is huge. It's developing in different phases. And the reason it's developing in phases is because of funding. And, you know, when you look at tribes in this sphere, you also have to think, well, is their land heavily fractionated and checkerboarded? And the reason that's so important is because that is something that a tribe or pueblo has to look at initially before even thinking about developing something like this. Do I have to buy the land back from my own tribal members or non-tribal members to be able to achieve this kind of project that I'm doing? And if I have to do that, where do I get those funds? And so I think for a tribal development, it's a lot of leveraging resources for your specific purpose and organizing those priorities on what you need to do first to be able to develop these. And then it's looking at, well, does the tribe internally have the funding from casinos, from fisheries, from whatever they have going on to be able to fund themselves to create this bank? Some tribes don't, and they fail. So a specific example to really look at and research how they did it would be Illumination. So, yeah. But I think we are way over time, guys. So I think we could talk about this all day, and I want to, join me in thanking our panelists. So.